Welcome to Risks and Trends, Polityka Insight's annual conference. This year, due to the unpredictability related to the pandemic, we decided to hold our conference in a studio without the audience, as we typically do. In 10 thematic blocks, we'll be speaking to experts, our friends, our guests, and we'll be discussing how we see the world. My name is Agnieszka Smoleńska, and I'm the Senior EU Affairs Analyst here at Polityka Insight. I will have the pleasure to discuss with our guests the transformation which the European Union is undergoing in the face of the pandemic, Brexit, and climate change. We'll be discussing how this affects the sovereignty of our countries, of Poland, and of the European Union. Welcome to another segment of our Europe section of 2021 Risks and Trends. In this panel, we'll be talking to Mr. Alexander Stubb, currently the director and professor of the School of Transnational Governance at the European University Institute. Also, Mr. Konrad Szymański, witam serdecznie, Minister for European Affairs in Poland since 2015, previously also member of the European Parliament. Witam serdecznie, thank you very much for being with us. I would like to start by taking a little bit stock of what happened in 2020. For many of us, forever 2020 will be associated with the pandemic. However, from a European perspective, 2020 was a year of fundamental change in many different ways. We had the European Green Deal, which marks a watershed moment in how European Union thinks about its industrial policy, in how it thinks about its transformative role in European economies. We had Brexit on the 1st of February 2020, which is the first time that a member state of the European Union has left. And it has marked a new opening in how European Union positions itself towards its partners in the world. Finally, we had the geopolitics shift. The changing winds in the US and the changing relations globally between China, US, and other big actors has made this year for the European Union a year of unprecedented challenges. Now, at the same time, Europe has fundamentally changed, you can argue, in this year. We had a new budget approved, which is almost twice as big as the one we had before. New debt will be issued, which will be issued at an unprecedented scale, and how it will be paid back is still to be determined. We had unprecedented coordination when it comes to coronavirus pandemic fight response. We had new forms of cooperation being developed, in particular the vaccination strategy. Now, what I wonder when I look at these transformations of the European Union is whether these changes will stick or whether they will be temporary, whether they will disappear, and whether this is a moment where the transformation of Europe is really pushing integration forward, or whether, in fact, it risks disintegrating. Have we gone too far too quickly? This is the question that I would like to pose to our panelists in the first place. Mr. Stubb, what's your take? What's your diagnosis?
Well, I think the starting point is very simple. We human beings have a tendency to do three things. Number one, we over-rationalize the past. So we draw parallels from the past to today, which really are not linked. Secondly, we have a tendency to over-dramatize the present. I'm not saying that you just over-dramatized it, but there was a lot of unprecedented language in what you just said. And finally, we have a tendency to underestimate the future. I'm much more relaxed, sometimes even a little bit agnostic about the way in which the European Union develops. I think there is quite often a functional spillover effect. So integration in one area leads to pressure to integrate in another one. At the same time, I am the first one to admit, as pro-European as I am, that the European Union is never going to be perfect and was never perfect. By that I mean that we advance always in 3 stages. Stage number 1 is a crisis, stage number 2 is chaos, and stage number 3 is a suboptimal solution. I can sit here on the margins of the development of European integration, eat a little bit popcorn and make commentary and enjoy it, but it's Konrad who sits in the middle of it and tries to sort it all out.
So that's a perfect transition. Panie Ministrze, what's your take? What's your diagnosis on?
Of course, I would agree that it's worth doing our best to preserve integration. That's why I'm worried, not satisfied, or I'm not ready to buy popcorn and see passively what's going on. It could be interesting, but also very negative. I would say that we should remember that we could create quite an answer to the pandemic crisis, especially in economic terms, with the instruments we already have on hands. So the adjustment, the treaty change at the moment isn't the most urgent thing. Although, of course, Warsaw, since Brexit, was pretty open to discuss it. We invited all capitals to talk about fundamental change of the Union, because Brexit is a warning. Brexit shouldn't be understood as an accidental thing. I think the mechanism which pushed Britain outside EU are present in many member states. Maybe the scale is different, but the nature of the mechanism is the same. We saw it very clearly during the budgetary debate, where we could notice that in many capitals, EU is only about costs. That the benefits of integration, especially benefits coming from the single market, are almost unknown and absent in the public debate. That's why this sort of budgetary populism pushed even most pro-European governments in frugal countries to the position where we had a real problem in the middle of pandemia, with triggering the right relevant answer to the economic consequences of pandemia. It worries me a lot, because I have no doubt about the intention of the frugals, but I see the political context, which is evolving in a very negative way, and I think we have to confront it, because in the same time the benefits of common market in average are 10 times higher than the so-called national contributions. And the national contributions consumed 99% of our attention when we talk about the EU budget, and in the end we have crises like this. I think we have to do something with this, because otherwise we will lose other countries.
I think the catch-22 situation, not only in Warsaw, but in every European capital, is that it's very difficult for democratically elected leaders to give any credit to Brussels for whatever it does. So in my experience, when I was foreign minister, finance minister, and prime minister, quite often what you would do, if something went wrong, you would blame Brussels. If something turned out good, you would take the credit. And I think that's a situation we're going to have in the pandemic as well. So basically, we're going to end up in a situation whereby, if the Commission eventually succeeds in the vaccine rollout, it is not going to get the credit. The credit is going to go to the capitals. If it fails in the vaccine rollout, then it is going to get the blame. So this is the big problem that we have. It's very difficult to fall in love with the internal market,
But you touched upon the vaccine strategy, which I think it's such a perfect example of complexity and confusion in Europe. You said I used too much the word precedent at the beginning, but it's quite clear that the European Commission negotiating on behalf of 27 member states is something that we have never done before.
Well, yes and no. I mean, remember that the European Union, in other words, the European Commission, has exclusive competence in 5 areas. One of those 5 areas is trade. So any big trade deal around the world, whether it's with Canada, with the United States, with Mercosur, or within the WTO, it is negotiated by the European Commission. Also remember that the European Commission has exclusive competence in competition policy, in other words, antitrust, the way in which companies around the world, whether they are Apple, whether they are Amazon, or whether they are Google, they have to abide by the rules negotiated by the European Commission. So it's not unprecedented. What is unprecedented is that they're negotiating in the middle of a pandemic in an area that it has not negotiated in before. And my point is here that I think it's extremely good that the European Commission is doing it. And I'll say it for two reasons. Number one, was it not the Commission doing the big deals with the pharmaceuticals, we would be involved in some kind of vaccine nationalism and vaccine wars. So Konrad and I would be going back and forth saying, we got more doses than you did. Secondly, I come from a small country, 5.5 million people. Do you seriously think that AstraZeneca or any other pharmaceutical company would be interested in negotiating scale with us? No. What would have happened was that both Germany and France would have gotten the big doses, and then they, at their own prerogative, would have perhaps given us a little bit of it. So I'm glad the Commission is doing it, even though it's not currently communicating it very well, I must admit.
That's one of shortcomings, definitely. Mr. Szymański, what's your take on this particular issue? Where does the Polish government also stand on this question of vaccine strategy and cooperation between the European Commission and member states?
I think it is right to say that an alternative to common purchases of the vaccine could be more harmful than the situation we have right now. But in the same time, if you take the responsibility for the process like the European Commission did, you have to be prepared and ready to accept also criticism. And I think the criticism is not concentrated on the purchases, but the effective execution of the contracts. It is not only responsibility of the European Commission, but this is how it works. If you go to the stage and want to take responsibility and power, then you have to face accountability. And it's true, it's not always very fair. That's the nature of politics. In the case of vaccine, I think the purchases was a good decision, but the rollout is a problem, and we have to be sincere between us.
So where is the...
And you know what, I fully agree with Konrad on that. You know, with power comes responsibility. And you know, this particular pandemic, this particular negotiation on the vaccine is simply too big to fail. I think that the Commission has to sustain, has to be able to absorb and tolerate a certain level of criticism coming from the member states, coming from an open and free media. That's in the nature of things.
Is it not that the European Union, which places itself as a defender of multilateralism, as a defender of global partnerships, now risks its image? So we are now discussing European sovereignty. And here we have a concrete example of the risks a European sovereignty creates. It can antagonize partners, it can create some legal uncertainty, it can create accountability problems for the European Commission, since there is apparently no right forum that can control it fully.
I think you shouldn't be speaking in the present tense. You can already speak in the past tense. The Commission really screwed this up. The damage is already done when it comes to communication, and it was a double whammy. The first one was the export restriction. The second one was the issue relating to the hard border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. They retracted, but now they have an uphill battle to try to fix the problem. Listen, with sovereignty and pooling of sovereignty comes different types of aspects, which are linked to responsibility, who takes care of what. But my argument on the particular vaccine things is along the lines that the negotiated deal originally was good. Now they need to get the rollout right. Sovereignty, you know, in a world where we really live transnationally, beyond the borders, where decisions are made not in a regional, national, or supranational vacuum, where every decision is touched by politics, by civil service, by journalism, by NGOs, by academia, and so on and so forth. I think it's a little bit old-fashioned to talk about black and white sovereignty. Sovereignty has been pooled, and that has been the case for the past 50, 60 years. And believe me, this pace is going to increase as technology evolves.
I think the vaccine incident, I mean this with the possible limitations of international trade of vaccine, is just a small example, maybe very bright, colorful, but example of the problem we will face in a time of crisis of multilateralism. It's impossible to defend multilateralism alone. It's a contradiction in nature. And our partners are not very keen to be very multilateral, and it is nothing new. The stage of the process is quite developed right now, but the process started many years ago. So when we, as Europe, are starting talking about sovereignty, it's natural reaction, because when you see the pharmaceutical strategy or industrial strategy, this way of thinking of shortening the trade lanes, the trade independence, about the way how to defend our own interests, especially in crisis situation. But of course, we know that after crisis, the whole solutions will stay with us. It's nothing unnatural. Of course, I believe that sovereignty is a central notion also for international relations, not to limit international cooperation, because it's impossible and wouldn't be wise, but to make a clear picture who is responsible for what and why we are doing something. And that's why I'm ready and I'm happy to continue this discussion about sovereignty, European sovereignty. But it's pretty clear that we have different sort of understanding of this. For some member states, European sovereignty is just a pretext for protectionism and just a pretext to cut cooperation in wider Western perspective or transatlantic perspective. Nothing new, but the cover is new. It wouldn't be good, because it is probably the worst time ever to cut cooperation when our different partners at the world stage are coming with quite competitive, to put it mildly, approach to Europe. So I'm surprised, because we used to believe that sovereignty is strengthened by the international cooperation. In the EU, we used to think that, come on, sovereignty is fine, it's even stronger because we shared sovereignty, and now we are stronger in the end, especially for smaller economies. It is absolutely right. But in the same time, probably the same persons would say that sovereignty means that we have to limit our cooperation with the rest of the world. I mean, our world, the Western world. This is something wrong. It is misleading understanding of sovereignty. For me, European sovereignty means a proper and effective establishment of standards in a new economy, in data protection, which reflects our way of thinking about individual versus corporation, individual versus state or organization. For me, the European sovereignty is also effective establishment of standards on chemical security long days ago, and export it effectively to the world, the rest of the world, which is good for Europe. It is also a question of cooperation with the US, not competition, in security. So it is not always about a limitation of thinking about ourselves. It's sometimes about just opposite, wider cooperation. Everything what would help us to strengthen our sovereignty, our objectivity at the world stage, is good for our sovereignty. So I think we should be a little bit more practical, and then we would understand where we are in this meta-political discussion about sovereignty or strategic autonomy. because it's pretty clear that we are talking about many different things at the same time. Not exactly with Alex, but with others.
Yeah, so there are also those who would advocate for substituting this idea of sovereignty with agility and more adaptability of the European Union and taking control of itself and really projecting power. So I'm very happy that we'll be in another segment. We are talking with Bradford, who's the author of the Brussels Effect book that precisely discusses how European Union projects its power. So maybe a final question, and this is circulating a little bit back to the discussion we had about at the beginning about the changes in European Union and perhaps the need for treaty change or rebalancing of the power between different institutions. So, Mr. Szymański, you mentioned that the Polish government would like to see some kind of change of the treaty happening. Where would you see this need for adjustment, in particular in this area of institutional change?
There is no single answer for the institutional character of the union because it's hybrid and it is community oriented in some aspects like trade or common market, and probably there is no alternative to community-based approach in things like this or custom union. It's pretty clear, and there are some other sectors, areas where we need more intergovernmental legitimization of the process. In time like this, in time of unpredictability, I think we need much more responsibility of the governments and ownership of the governments for the future of the union, because otherwise the process will detach and will be very easy target to blame for all mishappenings in the nearest future. I said that we are ready to talk about treaty, but in the same time we are pretty sure that treaty change isn't possible because any ratification or referendum in not two or three, but rather 6 or 8 countries would fail. And this is a warning, because if it's true, it means that the process is in crisis. We have to rebuild, revive the attractiveness of this process, not only for member states, but also for the people. And I see a chance for the future only in a proper community of democracies. I would stress the plural. EU is a community of democracies, a national democracies which expressed and legitimize an attitude toward this or that policy, this or that decision, this or that standpoint at international stage. Of course, it limits the scale of activity of the union, but I think it is wise to limit ourselves, because if you promise too much, you can be blamed unproportionally for any failure. So beware what you promise. This is my advice for the union of the next 2-3 years.
And can union do this within the existing treaty framework, or are we a little bit trapped?
I hope we can agree that we are quite successful in doing this with current treaty, but of course I understand the logic of criticism, and probably the critics are right to say that this system is a system which is an interpretation of the treaty. It is not a literal understanding of the treaty, because I remember the time when Lisbon was adopted, and many admirers of this treaty said that this is an enormous step, a leap toward more federal approach. Of course, in practice it is not true, because we, in place of community method, we have rather a union method, which is based on hybrid approach to all aspects of policy in the EU, community versus European Council, with our competence of giving a guidance, which is quite controversial today.
Thank you so much for this really interesting discussion. I very much enjoyed it. I hope you did as well as our listeners and spectators on the other side of the screen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Welcome to the next part of the European block of the Risks and Trends 2021 conference. My name is Piotr Buras. I'm the director of the European Council on Foreign Relations Warsaw office. And it's my great pleasure that ECFR is a partner organization of this conference. In this conversation, now we would like to look at the European Union's role in the world in a rapidly changing environment marked by a number of trends which cause, I would say, more than a headache for European countries and institutions. In the last few years, we have seen a return of power politics and a geopolitical struggle between the US and China for hegemony in the world. We have seen the Europeans being at pains, grappling with the destabilization of their immediate neighborhood. And the COVID-19 crisis challenged the idea of multilateralism as well as the idea of globalization. The political debate on how to respond to all those developments in the European Union has recently intensified, with the notions of Europe's strategic autonomy, European sovereignty, stirring up controversies across the continent and not at least in Poland. So the question is Europe fit for the world politics? Is it ready to live up to the challenges it is facing today? And if not, what needs to be done to increase Europe's or European Union's capacity to act and better protect our common interests and values? We will discuss these questions with my great guests. Patrycja Sasnal, the head of research of the Polish Institute for International Affairs and a renowned expert in international politics, most notably on the Middle East and the Arabic world. And Mark Leonard, ECFR's director, book author and columnist, regular contributor, among others, to the project Syndicate. It's a great pleasure and privilege to host you both here, and thank you very much for joining us. Mark, in a number of reports published by ECFR over the last year, you and your colleagues analyzed EU's actual and possible future responses to these mounting international problems. But before we delve into them, could you please first briefly describe why and how Europe's model has been particularly challenged by what seems to be a lasting transformation of the global landscape?
Sure. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, Piotr and Patrycja. I think that there is a sort of ideological dimension to this, and there's an institutional dimension. On the ideological side, Europeans, I think more than anyone else, thought that we were living at the end of history, that we were moving towards a period where globalization would benefit everybody, and instead of competition between countries, we'd have increasing cooperation with rules and diplomacy being used to determine the differences between countries, and in a whole series of different areas, from trade to technology to the solutions to global issues like climate, we would find a different way of working together. But instead, what has happened increasingly is that those links between countries are still there, but rather than being infused with a logic of cooperation, they are infused with a logic of competition, great power competition in particular. And we're seeing a lot of the ties that bind people together actually being turned into weapons. So instead of trade bringing people together, you get sanctions and trade wars. Instead of the internet bringing people together, you get cyber and fake news and election interference. And even the movement of people, which is the kind of fundamental thing which is bringing people together, was weaponized with people being forced out of their countries, Turkey trying to blackmail Europeans about whether it was going to open its borders or not. And that is a profound shock to the way that Europeans thought that the world was going to work. And it's taken a long time for them to catch up with it. And one of the reasons for that is the institutional problem, that whereas countries like America and China see a relationship between what they do in economic terms, what they do in political terms, or what they do in military terms. In Europe, these things were completely separated from one another. The market was to do largely with the behaviors of companies. The role of the state, to the extent that it had one, was about preserving competition in the interests of consumers. And we had lost the habit of having an industrial policy and of seeing this as a sort of political or geopolitical space. And that was also something that largely was done by Brussels. We gave over most of those powers to Brussels. And when it comes to political and military relations, they're more held at the level of member states, and are not typically linked with our economic relations in different areas. So we find ourselves having one hand tied behind our backs when we're dealing with countries that are willing to trade off what they do in one sector with other sectors. And the biggest shock to us was what Donald Trump was doing, because we thought of the US as an ally. And when we saw tariffs being introduced on national security grounds against European companies, and Trump saying that he would withdraw troops from Europe and disinvest from NATO unless we move what we were doing in trade policy. That was a complete shock to our system. We were just not really set up to deal with it. I think that has started to change dramatically over the last 3 or 4 years, both at an intellectual level and at an institutional level. And it's why we're having these debates about strategic autonomy and European sovereignty. But it's been quite a steep hill to climb for Europeans.
In the end of December, the EU hastily concluded the so-called comprehensive agreement on investments with China, and had to face criticism for basically failing to embrace the opportunity of coordinating the China strategy with the new Biden administration in the US. But in many experts and columnists maintain that this decision by the EU basically played into the hands of China and its strategy of dividing the West. But in the public conversation you had, Mark, with Josep Borrell, the head of EU's diplomacy, Borrell defended this decision and said that this is exactly the example of Europe's strategic autonomy. We just go it alone or do it our own way because our interests sometimes diverge also with the Americans, and this is the way how it should be. So do you agree with that, or do you have a different assessment of this agreement?
So one of the problems that we all have assessing this agreement is that it's not all been published. There are lots of addendums and protocols which are still being kept secret. So we only have partial information on it. I think the fact that they've not been published, not particularly good sign in terms of the confidence of the people who signed it. But I don't, in principle, have a problem with the idea of signing a comprehensive agreement on investment with the Chinese. We've been negotiating it for 7 years, and we have important Chinese investments in Europe, and nobody's saying that we shouldn't have any Chinese investments in Europe, and it's better to have that regulated than unregulated. And at the same time, there are a lot of European companies that have invested in China and that are short of protection. I think the whole way that the process was handled looked very clumsy. I think it has definitely destroyed a lot of trust, not just in Washington from the new incoming Biden administration, who reached out to Europeans and wanted to consult on it and urged them not to sign it so quickly, but also in other countries that will be critical partners for us as we try to defend a rule-based economic order in the future, such as Japan and India and Australia and Korea, countries that were horrified at the process and the way that we did it. So I think that it has done a lot of damage to European credibility with other countries. I do also think it has sent a bad signal to China that is relatively easy by making some what seemed like relatively small concessions to break the desire of Europeans and Americans to work together on issues of common concern. I don't think that it's that great a deal in the grand scheme of things. This deal has not yet been ratified. It's not entering into force. There's lots of time to change it and to have further discussions amongst Europeans in the future. And one of the important things about the Biden administration is they have signaled a very different way of dealing with these issues. The core of their approach to China is going to be about trying to work with allies and to try and find common cause rather than the unilateral aggressive approach that Donald Trump had put forward. If you read the article which Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and Kurt Campbell, who's the top China aide in the White House, wrote together in Foreign Affairs, they called it competition without catastrophe. And they want to avoid a Cold War, and they want to make sure that we can have coexistence with China in a way which allows us to stand up for our values. And that seems to be exactly what Europeans want from this relationship. So I think there is a lot of scope to work together closely. And, I think this may have created some bad blood and was probably a bit unnecessary rushing so quickly. So I don't think it was such a good idea moving forward in that way. But I don't think it's irreparable. And I am optimistic about our ability to try and find a new way forward. And I think that Europeans are not the only people who don't want to have a new Cold War between China and America. Most Asian countries want to maintain economic relationships with China, even as they deepen their cooperation with the United States. So I think that if we looked at it in that grand scheme of things, there's a lot of scope to develop new kinds of relationships, not just with Washington, but also with friendly countries such as Japan and Australia and other Asian countries.
But if we, Patrycja, if we take the bigger picture, and my question would be how likely and how possible and in what areas is a realignment of the European and American interests and approaches when it comes to international issues. And perhaps right away, a second question, should Poland be afraid that this European Sinatra doctrine, as Josep Borrell called it, could pull the EU away from the United States?
Right, that's a great question. I mean, with the Sinatra doctrine, we did it our way, right? We want to say we did it our way. And we wish it was this romantic Sinatra and not the punk anarchist Sid Vicious version of my way, right? I think Poland should not be afraid because a certain amount of European sovereignty and strategic autonomy is really necessary. I mean, who would not agree that there has been a certain, how to say it, arrogance or conceitedness in the US, in their foreign policies and in dealings with European partners. I think it's time for Biden to understand, and perhaps this agreement with China is just, it serves to elevate the negotiating position of Europeans vis-a-vis the US. So I think Biden needs to understand that it's about, and the Biden administration needs to understand that it's about bigger things than just single policy issues, that we need to act as a bloc long term. So that's that. Now, if you're asking about policy areas where this realignment and alignment is possible, I think there are a number of issues where this is possible. First is climate. And this issue trumps all other issues in the long term, because it's just so important for not only for the transatlantic area, but globally. And when the US and the EU, European countries, act together, they get things done. So I am hoping that things will get done here too. The other one is multilateralism and just underlining the importance of international organizations in the UN system, which has faltered under Trump. And without the US, things just don't work there. at all. They are hijacked by China and Russia. So and actually another point where alignment is possible is Russia. After Navalny's poisoning and his imprisonment, the attitudes in Europe are changing. Despite Germany's Germany's support for Nord Stream 2, Europeans are thinking about Russia differently these days, and this brings us together across the Atlantic. And then, of course, it's Iran and the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and the nuclear deal. Biden will surely want to get back to that deal and most likely renegotiate it, and then he will need European support and collaboration there. So an alignment is possible here for sure. I think it's one of those policy areas where it's certain. And then Ukraine, for example. If the US makes Ukraine a major US non-NATO ally, that would be in EU's interest. I mean, perhaps with the exception of Hungary. But Biden will insist on more effective fight against corruption and conducting judicial reform in Ukraine. This is also what the EU wants. So I think there's a number of issues where alignment is possible. And just the bottom line here is that there will be sheer added value in the fact that the EU and the US will stand together on a number of issues and will be perceived as speaking in unison. I think only then we get things done, when we do them together, the EU and the US together. So this in itself will give both the EU and US greater agency in foreign policy, whatever they do.
Yeah, thanks, Patrycja. I'd like to turn back to Mark for a while, because we had a very interesting poll at the CFR, a transatlantic poll, or rather a poll in 11 European countries on the transatlantic relations, on the perceptions of European societies of America. And my question to you is if you could summarize very briefly the key takeaways and tell us what do they mean for the future of the transatlantic relation? Do they bode well for the revival of the West?
So very briefly, what our poll showed is that Europeans everywhere are happy to see Biden elected to the White House, but they have big doubts about whether America can come back as a global leader. And there are different dimensions to that. A majority think the American political system is broken. Many think you can't trust the Americans not to vote for another Trump again after 2016. And more important than the crisis of American democracy is a crisis of American power. We found that a majority of people everywhere thought that China will overtake America as the most powerful country in the world within the next decade. And also that Americans can't be relied upon to defend Europeans from all the problems that we have. And they're drawing quite radical policy conclusions from that. Firstly, they think that we should invest in our own defense rather than relying on the Americans. Secondly, a majority of people in all the countries surveyed said that if there's a dispute between China and America, Europeans should stay neutral rather than taking America's side. And thirdly, and most interestingly, in many countries, not in Poland, but in almost all the other big European countries, people said that the go-to capital is now Berlin rather than Washington. So that is quite a shock, I think, to many people coming into the White House, because I think they were not necessarily surprised that people were horrified by what Trump did to American democracy. But the fact that Europeans seem to see American power disappearing, I think, is a real shock. And also, above all, the idea that a majority of Europeans want to stay neutral rather than taking America's side. I think a lot of Democrats would have thought that it was legitimate to say that when Trump was president, given that he was pursuing a very unilateral strategy. But they were hoping that Europeans would not have that approach now that Biden's come in. I think what it shows is that if we have a new transatlantic relationship, it's going to have to look slightly different to how it looked before. And I think there is a lot of scope for cooperation, but Americans are going to have to prove that they have the staying power and the might to actually back up what they say with real policies. And we're going to have to show Europeans that it's in their interest to work more closely with the Chinese. I think, with the Americans. I think what happened with the comprehensive agreement on investment with China shows that it's difficult. It's not just European citizens that are skeptical about America's ability to come back, but Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron obviously had their doubts as well, which is why they rushed into signing this agreement. And that is quite scary from an American perspective, because Angela Merkel is not Gerhard Schröder. She's somebody who even supported the Iraq War. She's a died in the war Atlanticist rather than somebody who harbors anti-American feelings.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, Patrycja, for this excellent, very inspiring conversation. And thank you all on the other side of the screens for bearing with us until the end of this conversation. I wish you all the best, and bye-bye.
Thanks.
In this section of our Risks and Trends Europe section, we'll be talking about how the European Union regulates the market, and specifically what benefits it derives from how it approaches market regulation. I am very excited to speak about these topics with our guest, Professor Anu Bradford, Professor of Law at Columbia University. Welcome. Who has written one of the most interesting books of last year called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World, published with Oxford University Press. So it's quite a big title, so let us start with unpacking what exactly it means. What is the Brussels effect, and what is it about the European Union that makes it possible? What specific features of how the European Union regulates the market? What is it about its institutions that make the Brussels effect possible?
Absolutely. So what do I mean by the Brussels effect? I think that is the question we should start with. So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the European Union. So as the price for accessing the lucrative European markets, these companies need to comply with European regulations. But often they decide that it is in their interest to apply these regulations across their global production and across their global conduct, because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. It is then the business interests and the market forces that are driving the global companies to externalize these EU rules across the global markets.
Could you maybe give us some examples of the areas where this is possible? There are specific fields you look at in your book.
Yeah, so what to me makes the Brussels effect so interesting is that it really happens across a wide range of policy domains and industries. So if we start, for instance, of these big technology companies in the United States and focus on the digital economy, if you look at the privacy policies of big companies like Google or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft, these companies follow the European GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, across the world. If you also look at the rules that companies like Twitter and YouTube use when they decide what kind of speech they take down as hate speech, they don't follow American First Amendment that guarantees free speech. They look to the European definition of hate speech. And the examples are not just pertaining to American companies or the digital economy. The Brussels effect also impacts, and the EU law shapes how timber is harvested in Indonesia, what kind of pesticides Cameroonian cocoa farmers use, what kind of facilities Chinese dairy factories install in their factories, what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers use. So it is really a phenomenon that manifests itself in different industries and across different policy domains.
we often discuss about the European Union, how it's weak and how it doesn't have any external power, how even the soft law instruments it has are not very effective. But what you are describing as essentially is a wealth of evidence to the contrary, which shows that the European Union really does project its power across the world.
Yeah, indeed. So in many ways, my book is an invitation for us to consider what power means in today's world and what kind of influence really matters. So we're absolutely right if we concede that the EU is not a military power. It also has limited ability to govern the world through financial sanctions, for instance. But in many ways, regulatory power, it is very tangible. It is something that we don't always notice because it goes under the radar. It is not something that is traditionally associated with the hard power or even soft power. It falls somewhere in between. At the same time, it is the kind of power that is very influential in that it affects each and every one of us every day. It affects the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we produce and consume. And to me, that is really influence, and that is power.
But then the question comes, if these are the rules that we project across the world, then we inevitably end up thinking about who makes the rules and who benefits from these rules. It's quite easy to see that if there are regulations, they must generate winners and losers. Is this something that you look at as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a really interesting question of who benefits from the Brussels effect. And I would start by singling out probably the clearest winners. And if you think about European companies, they need to follow European rules. They are their own rules. But when they compete on export markets, the problem would be if they then are at disadvantage vis-a-vis foreign companies that would not be obliged to follow the same kind of rules. But if you take the Brussels effect seriously and believe that it is really shaping the regulatory environment even outside of the EU, it means that the EU can level the playing field and it can protect the competitiveness of the European industry that is now not at disadvantage because also the American companies are following the European rules when they are competing with EU companies in Brazil. So it is a big benefit for the European companies because they do not need to bear the cost of being the only ones that are complying. Also, obviously, European consumers, many of these rules, I would say that they really stem from being responsive to the European consumers' preferences, who care about sustainability, who care about protecting our climate, who care about food safety, the fundamental right to privacy, the competitive marketplace that lowers the prices for consumers and introduces more choice. So the consumers often in Europe are also happy to see that we export these sustainability norms in the global marketplace. It does help us protect the climate if it's not just in Europe where we see these efforts being taken. The more complicated question is how the foreign stakeholders experience these rules. And yes, I am quite willing to concede that there are, for instance, some foreign consumers who do not share the preferences of European consumers, who would rather pay less for a product than have a product that is more sustainable, who may not care about the personal right to privacy to the same extent. So yes, they are being served products and services that are conform to European preferences, so they could be perceived as losers. But at the same time, there are so many foreign consumers who actually welcome the Brussels effect as the way to offset the regulatory deficiencies of their own governments. Thanks to European Union, they do not have harmful chemicals pollute their rivers or endanger their personal health. They are grateful that somebody is looking after their personal privacy. And the foreign governments also fall a little bit in two camps. So there are some foreign governments who say that, look, the Brussels effect undermines our regulatory sovereignty. It is an assault on democracy because we no longer have the ability to decide what rules better work in our societies. We are bystanders when the EU regulates our markets. But there are also many foreign governments who, for instance, don't have the capacity to tackle global cartels and are quite happy that the EU's competition law is taking care of that and extending those preferences to them as well, who would like to protect the environment more, but don't have the capacity to go after big chemical companies and change their production patterns. So in that sense, there are both winners and losers, and it is not Europe versus the rest of the world. There are many stakeholders outside the EU that are big beneficiaries and big fans of the Brussels effect.
But what about inside the EU? Because you treat a little bit the industry as if it's has one homogeneous interest, and maybe the citizens also have heterogeneous preferences across the EU. So I just wondered when I was reading your book, if whose interests, or if you can't make the argument that it's particular part of the European economy that benefits from the Brussels effect more than others, or citizens of part of the European Union as opposed to others?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think you're very right to point out that often these regulations emanate from a rather contested regulatory process within the EU itself. So there are certain political parties, certain governments or consumer groups, for instance, who may not be as big fans, so certain companies that do not endorse all these rules to the same extent. But often what makes it interesting is that when there is contestation on the rules, for instance, on the international domain, often we see the lowest common denominator to prevail. But we see the opposite in the EU. So who is really getting the preferences translated into EU regulation often tends to be the pro-regulation states, that the stakeholders that are advocating more rather than less regulation. And the reason is that often these regulations first emanate from some member states. So the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, wasn't invented first in Brussels. Germany was one of the forerunners, France, Sweden, that went ahead with stringent privacy laws. Then the EU steps in when it realizes that the marketplace becomes fragmented and there's a problem if data cannot flow across the common European marketplace. So what the EU tends to do is, instead of asking Germany to back down and protect privacy less, telling France that you cannot protect privacy, it is elevating the other member states as well to the level that calls for more regulation. So in many ways, yes, there is contestation within the EU. Often the regulations that are relating to single market also get to the highest possible level of regulation, because we do not need every member state to agree. These are not subject to unanimity. So like with many European issues, there are compromises. There are member states whose first choice would not be this regulation. But ultimately, this is one of the benefits or cost of being part of the European Union.
So you can almost argue that we have qualified majority voting in some aspects of European foreign policy.
It's a very interesting way. Nobody has really put it that way. But if you consider, and that's another question, is the Brussels effect a foreign policy instrument? It certainly is an instrument that affects our foreign relations to a significant extent. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that it is actually a tool for geopolitics. But I like the framing and the invitation to think about it.
What I found very interesting in your book as well is that you quite strongly argue that it's not protectionist, that the Brussels effect doesn't have this feature of being protectionist and isolating the European market, let's say. But with the Brexit in particular, now we have this trend or growing trend to talk about the European sovereignty, to use competition policy more for protectionist ends, so fostering European champions. Do you think that this trend, if you agree that it is there, do you think that it poses risks from the perspective of the efficacy of the Brussels effect?
So absolutely, I really appreciate the question. I think it's a big question and a very important question. So if we first look back to what the track record of the EU's regulation has been. There are those who perceive it as a manifestation of European protectionism, especially in the United States, where I'm having my conversations. I often get asked, why is the EU going after these big American technology companies? Is it some envy-driven protectionist zeal where the EU is trying to level the opportunities for its less competitive tech companies? And there, I take quite strong view that what is not driving the EU regulation to date is protectionism. The EU is not going after Google because it is trying to protect some European search engine. There is no rival to Google in the EU to protect. If you also look at these big competition cases against American companies, often there's an American company on the other side of the dispute. So who brought the first complaint to the Commission when the Commission started investigating Google? It was Microsoft. So often there are American companies on both sides of the disputes and not European companies that benefit if American companies, the practices are restricted. So in that sense, I think the protectionism up until today has been a rather false accusation of what the EU is doing. And the EU has not been, for instance, building national champions. The Commission was criticized by France and Germany for blocking the attempted rail merger between Siemens and Alstom that would have created a European champion that could have potentially competed then better against Chinese counterparts. That was the argument. The Commission refused to take that because the Commission saw that its mandate is to protect European consumers and not to create European champions. But I absolutely agree with you that we are seeing a change in the tone of the conversation. And we saw, for instance, France and Germany come up with this manifesto asking to reform the merger control policy and reshape the competition regulation in a way that it would allow for the creation of European champions. And I share your concern that now that the UK, that has been always more skeptical of regulation, a proponent of free markets, when the UK is not part of these conversations, there's more space for instance, French industrial policy inclinations to prevail. So there's certainly a danger of going down that path. And if you take the Brussels effect seriously, you should take this danger very seriously. Because if the EU has been successfully exporting its neutral competition rules, for instance, it certainly would be exporting its protectionist competition rules. And the European companies would face protectionist regulatory regimes in different parts of the world as well. So it would be very hard to contain the kind of industrial policy-driven regulation to the EU, given how influential the EU is in shaping the global regulatory environment.
And so it's the European Commission that is the agent of Brussels effect to a big extent. It's especially when it comes to the nitty-gritty of the European regulations, when it comes to preparing the proposals, when it comes to enforcing competition law, the European Commission is in the lead. And what specific risks or maybe opportunities come from calling the European Commission more and more political, even geopolitical? Is that also a potential risk to the Brussels effect?
I would say that it can be. So now there is a change also in the conversation of this tendency to geopoliticize the whole conversation about regulation and trade and policy making. And I don't think that serves the Brussels effect well. The Brussels effect is not a geopolitical tool. It is a technocratic way of governing the EU that automatically can deploy the power of the markets to under the radar transfer the global marketplace. It has partially been so successful because it has been this kind of quiet technocratic power, because we haven't elevated these questions to the level of big political battles. And if we try to use this instrument towards geopolitical tools, I'm afraid we may lose some of that effectiveness that comes from this more quiet, more passive way of exerting influence.
One thing that I wondered about was the rule of law, and if the rule of law is a question that is linked to the Brussels effect, and in what way? I mean, Brussels effect relies on the legal infrastructure.
Absolutely. So it is a story about the power of law. And in many ways, if you think about why the EU has been so successful, is that the quality of the legal framework that underlies it. And I would say that, again, if you take the Brussels effect seriously, it is particularly important because if the EU gets it right, it can get it globally right because the effects are global. But if your EU gets it wrong, it can get it globally wrong. And I would be very worried about the kind of legal framework governing the global marketplace that wasn't founded on a solid rule of law.
Professor Bradford, thank you so much for this very interesting conversation. Thank you for explaining to us what the Brussels effect is and what effects it has as well. Thank you.
That was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for the 60 minutes spent in front of the screen with us. I encourage you warmly to watch the other recordings of the Risks and Trends conference. A warm thank you to the partners of our conference.